James Turner stepped out of his rental car at Denver International Airport on what seemed like any other Tuesday morning. The cool mountain air hit his face as he grabbed his simple black duffel bag from the trunk. At 43 years old, James had been through this routine countless times, but today felt different. He wasn't here as the respected Federal Aviation Administration inspector that he truly was. Today he was supposed to blend in to see what regular passengers experienced. When they tried to fly, his clothes were carefully chosen for this mission. No expensive suit, no official badge visible, no government-issued briefcase. Instead, he wore faded blue jeans, a plain gray polo shirt, and comfortable sneakers that had seen better days. His wedding ring was the only piece of jewelry he wore, and even his watch was a simple digital one he'd picked up at a drugstore. Everything about his appearance screamed ordinary traveler, which was exactly what his supervisors had requested. James walked through the sliding glass doors into the bustling terminal. The familiar sounds of rolling luggage, chattering voices, and overhead announcements filled the air. He'd been in hundreds of airports throughout his 15-year career with the FAA, but he'd never paid attention to them quite like this. Usually he was there in his official capacity, wearing his government credentials, meeting with airport managers and airline executives. People treated him with respect, even deference, when they saw that badge, but not today. Today he was investigating something far more serious than mechanical safety issues or regulatory compliance. His department had received multiple complaints over the past 6 months about discriminatory treatment at this very airport. Passengers, particularly those of color, had reported being singled out, questioned more harshly, and treated with suspicion by certain airline staff members. The complaints had been detailed and disturbing, but they needed proof before they could take action. James checked his phone and noted the time. His flight to Atlanta was scheduled to depart in 2 hours, giving him plenty of time to observe the normal passenger experience. He'd already done his homework on this assignment. The gate he was flying from, B-27, had been mentioned in several of the complaints. The same gate agent had been working there for over a decade, and her name kept appearing in incident reports. As he made his way through security, James found himself thinking about his own experiences. In all his years of government service, he'd rarely faced the kind of treatment that these complainants described. But then again, he'd rarely traveled without his credentials visible. People knew who he was, knew what authority he carried. Today would be different. The security checkpoint went smoothly enough. James kept his interactions brief and polite, just like any regular passenger would. He noticed how differently the TSA agents treated him compared to their usual deference when he traveled officially. They were professional but distant, going through their routine without the small talk and courtesy they usually showed him. After collecting his belongings from the security bins, James found a coffee shop near his gate. He wanted to observe the area before his flight to get a feel for how things operated when no one knew a federal inspector was watching. He ordered a simple black coffee and found a seat with a clear view of gate B-27. The gate area was busy with travelers from various walks of life. Business people typed on laptops, families with children spread out across multiple seats, elderly couples read books together. James watched as different passengers approached the gate counter for various reasons. Some needing seat changes, others asking about delays or connections. What he noticed over the next hour troubled him. The gate agent, a woman who appeared to be in her 50s with short brown hair and a stern expression, treated passengers very differently depending on their appearance. When well-dressed white passengers approached with questions, she was helpful and patient. She smiled, made eye contact, and took time to address their concerns thoroughly. But when passengers of color approached the counter, her entire demeanor changed. Her voice became colder, her responses shorter. She scrutinized their documents more carefully, asked additional questions that she hadn't asked others, and seemed to look for reasons to create problems rather than solve them. James pulled out a small notebook and began documenting what he observed, being careful to look like he was just writing personal notes or perhaps working on something for his job. He recorded times, descriptions of incidents, and the different treatment patterns he witnessed. This was exactly the kind of evidence His department needed Dot as his boarding time approached. James felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. He'd investigated discrimination cases before, but always from the outside, always with his authority clearly established. This time, he was about to walk into a situation where he might face that discrimination personally. He thought about his wife back home, about the conversations they'd had about raising their teenage son in a world where his skin color might make others question his worth or his honesty. James finished his coffee and walked toward the gate. His passport was tucked securely in his jacket pocket right next to his backup federal credentials that he hoped he wouldn't need to use. The passport had seen plenty of use over the years. Its pages were well worn from international inspections, business trips, and family vacations. Some of the stamps were faded, and the cover showed signs of being carried in countless pockets and bags. He'd never thought twice about his passport's appearance before. It was valid, legal, and official. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes, he wondered if its worn condition might be seen as suspicious by someone looking for reasons to create problems. The boarding announcement crackled over the intercom, and James joined the line forming at the gate. He watched as the same agent who had been treating passengers differently all morning prepared to check boarding passes and identification. Other passengers chatted casually as they waited, most of them unaware of the tension building in James's chest. This wasn't just about his investigation anymore. This was about every person of color who had ever been made to feel unwelcome or unwanted while simply trying to travel. This was about the complaints his office had received, about the stories of humiliation and discrimination that had led to this undercover assignment. James reached into his pocket and felt the reassuring presence of his federal credentials. He was a respected government official with the power to ground aircraft and impose serious penalties on airlines that violated federal regulations. But in this moment, approaching that gate counter, he was also just another black man trying to board a plane, hoping he would be treated with the same dignity and respect that every passenger deserved. The line moved forward, and James's turn was approaching. He took a deep breath and prepared to find out exactly what kind of treatment regular passengers like him could expect at Gate B27. James stepped forward when his turn came, holding his boarding pass and passport ready. The gate agent, whose name tag read Patricia, looked up at him with an expression that immediately felt different from how she'd greeted the passengers before him. Her smile, which had been warm and welcoming just moments earlier for a young white couple, disappeared completely. "Boarding pass and identification," Patricia said curtly, not making eye contact. Her tone was flat and businesslike, lacking any of the pleasantries James had heard her exchange with other travelers. James handed over his documents with a polite smile. "Good morning. Beautiful day for flying, isn't it?" Patricia barely acknowledged his friendly greeting. Instead, she grabbed his passport and held it under the desk lamp, examining it with unusual intensity. James watched as she flipped through the pages slowly, studying each stamp and marking with the kind of scrutiny he'd never seen applied to travel documents during routine boarding. "This passport has seen better days," Patricia muttered loud, enough for nearby passengers to hear. She held it up to the light, squinting at the pages as if she was examining a suspicious $20 bill. James felt his heartbeat quicken, but he kept his voice calm and steady. "Yes, I travel quite a bit for work. It's completely valid, though." "We'll see about that," Patricia replied, her voice carrying a tone of skepticism that made several passengers in line behind James crane their necks to see what was happening. She opened the passport to his photo page and looked back and forth between James and the picture multiple times. The photo was only 3 years old, taken when he'd renewed his passport for a work trip to Europe. He looked virtually identical to the picture, perhaps with a few more gray hairs around his temples, but otherwise exactly the same. "This doesn't look like you," Patricia announced, holding the passport at arm's length as if it was contaminated. James blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry, what do you mean? That's definitely me in the photo." "The facial structure is different. The nose doesn't match. And your skin tone looks darker in person than in this picture," Patricia said. Her voice growing louder with each word, a middle-aged woman behind James in line whispered to her husband, "What's taking so long?" James could feel the weight of attention from other passengers as Patricia continued her examination. "Ma'am, I can assure you that's me in the photo. I renewed this passport just 3 years ago at the post office in my hometown. If there's a specific concern, maybe we could—" "Don't tell me how to do my job," Patricia interrupted sharply. "I've been working in aviation security for 12 years. I know a questionable document when I see one." James noticed that Patricia had taken nearly 5 minutes to examine his documents, while the passengers before him had been processed in less than 30 seconds each. He glanced at the clock on the wall behind the counter. Other passengers were starting to look impatient, and some were checking their watches. "Is there a supervisor I could speak with?" James asked politely. "I'm not sure what the issue is, but I'd like to resolve this quickly so other passengers can board." Patricia's eyes flashed with anger. "Now you're trying to rush me? That makes this even more suspicious. Why are you in such a hurry if everything is legitimate?" The irony wasn't lost on James. He was trying to be considerate of other passengers, but Patricia was twisting his courtesy into evidence of wrongdoing. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that this was exactly the kind of treatment the complainants had described. "I'm not trying to rush anyone," James said carefully. "I just want to understand what the problem is so we can solve it." Patricia held up the passport again, this time waving it slightly so other passengers could see. The problem is that this document has clearly been tampered with. Look at these pages. They're worn. Some of the stamps are faded, and the binding is loose. This is exactly what fake passports look like when they've been handled by multiple people. James felt a surge of frustration but kept his voice level. "Ma'am, that's simply normal wear and tear from legitimate travel. I've been to 12 countries in the past 2 years for business trips. Of course it shows some use." "Business trips?" Patricia scoffed. "What kind of business?" James paused. This was the moment he had to decide how much to reveal. He couldn't lie about his occupation, but he also couldn't blow his cover by mentioning his government position. "I work in aviation safety," he said truthfully, though he deliberately kept it vague. "Aviation safety?" Patricia laughed mockingly. "Right, and I suppose you're some kind of expert who knows more about document security than I do?" The line behind James was getting longer, and he could hear murmurs of annoyance from waiting passengers. A businessman in an expensive suit tapped his foot impatiently and checked his phone. A family with young children looked frustrated as their kids started to get restless. Patricia seemed to feed off the growing tension. She called over to another date agent working nearby. "Hey, Linda, come take a look at this. Tell me what you think about this passport." Linda, a younger woman who had been efficiently processing passengers at the adjacent gate, walked over reluctantly. She glanced at James's passport quickly and shrugged. "Looks fine to me, just well-traveled." Patricia's face reddened slightly. "You're not looking carefully enough. The photo doesn't match, and the document shows signs of alteration." Linda looked more closely at the passport, then at James, then back at the passport. "Patricia, I really don't see any issues here. The photo clearly matches and travel wear is completely normal." "Fine, if you won't back me up, I'll handle this myself," Patricia snapped. Linda gave James an apologetic look and returned to her own station. Patricia turned back to James with renewed determination. "I'm calling this into security. This document is suspicious, and I have a responsibility to protect the safety of this aircraft and its passengers." James felt his stomach drop. He'd expected some difficult treatment, but he hadn't anticipated having his credentials questioned to this extent. He thought about the federal ID in his pocket, the one that could end this confrontation immediately. But using it would compromise his investigation and potentially allow the discrimination to continue for future passengers who didn't have his authority to fall back on. "Ma'am, I understand you're trying to do your job, but I can assure you that passport is completely legitimate. Is there a specific policy or procedure you're following that I should know about?" Patricia's voice rose even higher. "Are you questioning my authority? I don't have to explain airline security procedures to you." What I have to do is make sure people like you don't get on planes with fake documents. The phrase, people like you, hung in the air like a slap. Several passengers in. Line shifted uncomfortably, and James saw one woman pull out her phone and start recording. Patricia either didn't notice or didn't care that her behavior was being documented. James realized that this confrontation was spiraling beyond anything he'd expected. He was witnessing firsthand the exact kind of discriminatory treatment that had prompted his investigation, but experiencing it personally was far more intense than reading about it in complaint reports. The situation was about to get much worse. Patricia picked up the phone at her desk and dialed a number, never taking her eyes off James. Her voice carried across the gate area. She spoke into the receiver. Security? This is Patricia at gate B27. I need assistance with a passenger who's presenting questionable travel documents. Yes, I'll hold. James stood there, feeling dozens of eyes on him. The boarding line had grown to nearly 50 people, and conversations had died down as passengers realized something serious was happening. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking why everyone had stopped moving. Business travelers checked their watches anxiously, worried about missing their connections in Atlanta. Ma'am, while we're waiting, could you please tell me your name and employee number? James asked politely. I'd like to document this interaction for my own records. Patricia's grip tightened on the phone. You don't need my information? I'm not the one with the problem here. Actually, I think I do have a right to know who I'm dealing with, especially if you're making official accusations about my documents, James replied, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. Don't you dare try to intimidate me, Patricia shot back. I've dealt with people like you before, and your tactics don't work on me. An elderly man in line behind James stepped forward. Excuse me, but what exactly is the problem? Here? This gentleman seems perfectly reasonable, and we're all trying to catch the same flight. Patricia whirled around to face the man. Sir, I need you to step back. This is a security matter, and I don't need passengers interfering with my investigation. Investigation? A woman's voice called out from further back in the line. It's a passport check, not a criminal case. James could see Patricia growing more flustered as other passengers began to question her behavior. She spoke into the phone again, this time with more urgency. Where is security? I told you this was urgent. I have a situation that needs immediate attention. 2 airport security officers appeared at the gate within minutes. They were both middle-aged men in uniform, walking with the casual confidence of people who dealt with passenger disputes every day. James felt a flicker of hope that trained security personnel might bring some rationality to the situation. What's the problem here? The taller officer asked, looking between Patricia and James. Patricia immediately launched into her explanation. This man is trying to board with a fraudulent passport. The photo doesn't match. The document shows signs of tampering, and he's been argumentative and aggressive when I questioned him about it. James's mouth fell open. I haven't been argumentative or aggressive. I've been nothing but polite and cooperative. The second security officer, a shorter man with graying hair, looked at James's passport. He examined it for about 30 seconds, far less time than Patricia had spent on it, and handed it back. This looks fine to me. What specifically makes you think it's fraudulent? Patricia's face reddened. Look at the wear patterns on the pages. Look at how the photo doesn't quite match his facial features. And look at his behavior. He's been defensive and demanding information he has no right to have. I asked for her name and employee number, James explained to the officers. That seemed like a reasonable request given the circumstances. The taller officer nodded. That is a reasonable request. Ma'am, you should provide your name and employee information when a passenger asks for it during an official interaction. I don't have to provide anything to someone who's traveling with fake documents. Patricia insisted. James watched in amazement as Patricia doubled down on her accusations. He'd seen stubborn people before, but this was beyond anything he'd encountered in his professional life. Even when other employees and security officers disagreed with her assessment, she refused to back down. The shorter officer looked at the passport again, then at James. Sir, this document appears to be completely legitimate. I'm not sure what the issue is here. That's when Patricia made the decision that would change everything. Without warning, she grabbed the passport from the officer's hands and before anyone could react, tore it in half. The sound of ripping paper cut through the gate area like a gunshot. Conversations stopped completely. Parents pulled their children closer. The security officers stepped back in shock. There, Patricia announced, triumphantly holding up the two halves of James's passport. Now he can't use this fake document to board any aircraft. I'm confiscating this evidence of fraud. The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at the remains of his passport, unable to process what had just happened. The document that had taken him around the world, that represented his ability to travel freely as an American citizen, was now nothing more than torn paper in the hands of an airline employee. "Ma'am," the taller security officer said slowly, "you cannot destroy someone's travel documents. That's a federal offense." "It was fraudulent," Patricia replied, but her voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "I was protecting airline security. Even if you suspected it was fraudulent, which it clearly wasn't, you don't have the authority to destroy it," the officer continued. "You've just committed a serious crime." James finally found his voice. "You just destroyed my passport." "My valid, legal passport that I need to travel home to my family." Several passengers had pulled out their phones and were recording the entire scene. James could see the red recording lights, capturing every moment of what was happening. Part of him was grateful for the documentation, but another part felt humiliated that his treatment was becoming a public spectacle. "This is unbelievable," someone in the crowd muttered. "She actually tore up his passport," another voice said. In disbelief, Patricia seemed to realize for the first time that her actions might have consequences. She looked at the torn passport in her hands, then at the security officers, then at the crowd of passengers staring at her in shock. "I was just doing my job," she said weakly. "No, you weren't," the shorter officer replied firmly. "You were way outside the bounds of your authority." "Sir," he turned to James, "I'm going to need to call this in to federal authorities. Destroying someone's passport is a federal crime, and this incident needs to be reported properly." James nodded, his mind racing. This was far beyond what he'd expected when he'd started his undercover investigation. He'd come to document discrimination, not to become the victim of a federal crime. The torn passport in Patricia's hands represented not just his personal travel document, but evidence of something much larger and more serious. "I want to file a formal complaint," James said clearly, loud enough for everyone in the area to hear. "Against both the employee and the airline." Patricia's face went pale. "You can't do that. I was protecting everyone. I was following security protocols." "There's no security protocol that allows you to destroy valid travel documents," the taller officer said. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step away from the counter. This is now a police matter." As if summoned by his words, two police officers appeared at the gate. James realized that this situation was spiraling far beyond a simple discrimination case. He was now dealing with destroyed federal documents, potential criminal charges, and a very public incident that was being recorded by multiple witnesses. The investigation he'd started that morning had just become something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. The two police officers who arrived at Gate B-27 looked like they'd seen everything during their years patrolling the airport. Officer Rodriguez, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes, surveyed the scene quickly. Her partner, Officer Chung, was older and moved with the calm confidence that comes from handling thousands of passenger disputes. "What do we have here?" Officer Rodriguez asked. Looking at the torn passport pieces still clutched in Patricia's hands, the airport security officers quickly filled them in on what had happened. As they spoke, James noticed Patricia's expression changing from defiant to worried. She kept glancing around as if looking for an escape route, but there was nowhere to go with dozens of passengers and multiple officials surrounding the gate. "Counter. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to hand over those passport pieces," Officer Chun said to Patricia. "They're evidence now." Patricia reluctantly placed the torn halves on the counter. Even destroyed, James could see his photo and personal information clearly visible on the damaged document. The sight of his mutilated passport filled him with a mixture of anger and sadness. This wasn't just paper, it was his proof of citizenship, his key to the world, torn apart because of one person's prejudice. "Sir, can you tell us exactly what happened here?" Officer Rodriguez asked James. James took a deep breath and began recounting the entire incident from the beginning. He described how Patricia had treated him differently from other passengers, how she'd scrutinized his documents far longer than necessary, and how she'd made increasingly unreasonable accusations. As he spoke, several passengers in line nodded their heads, confirming his version of events. "She was definitely treating him different from everyone else," called out the elderly man who had tried to intervene earlier. "I watched her check other people's passports and she barely looked at them. But with this gentleman, she acted like she was investigating a crime. I recorded some of it on my phone," added a young woman holding up her device. "You can see how she was talking to him compared to other passengers." Officer Chun looked at Patricia. "Do you want to explain why you destroyed this man's passport?" Patricia's voice shook as she answered. "I thought it was fake. The photo looked wrong and the document was worn out. I was trying to protect the airline and the other passengers. Even if you suspected fraud, which this clearly wasn't, you don't have the authority to destroy federal documents," Officer Rodriguez explained. "That's a serious crime." James watched Patricia's face as the reality of her situation began to sink in. Her earlier confidence had completely disappeared, replaced by fear and confusion. She kept looking around as if hoping someone would come to her defense, but even her fellow airline employees were keeping their distance. "Look, maybe we can work this out," Patricia said desperately. "I'll pay for a new passport. I'll write an apology letter." "I didn't mean for this to happen," Officer Chun shook his head. "Ma'am, it's not that simple. You've committed a federal offense. This isn't something we can just work out between us." That's when James made his decision. He'd watched this situation spiral completely out of control, and he realized it was time to reveal who he really was. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his federal credentials. "Officers, I think there's something you need to know," James said quietly. "I'm not just a regular passenger." He opened his credential case and showed his official Federal Aviation Administration identification. The badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and his photo stared back at them from the official government document. "I'm Inspector James Turner with the FAA. I was conducting an undercover investigation when this incident occurred." The silence that followed was absolute. Patricia's face went completely white. The airport security officers exchanged glances. Even the police officers seemed taken aback by this revelation. Officer Rodriguez was the first to speak. "You're a Federal Aviation Inspector?" "That's correct. I've been investigating complaints of discriminatory treatment at this gate. What happened to me today is exactly what other passengers have been reporting for months." Patricia staggered backward as if she'd been physically hit. You're with the government?" "Yes, I am." "And you just destroyed the passport of a federal employee who was conducting an official investigation. You also interfered with a government operation." The crowd of passengers erupted in whispers and exclamations. People were pulling out phones to capture this new development. James could hear fragments of conversation. "He's a federal inspector. She destroyed a government agent's passport. This is going to be all over the news." A man in an airline supervisor's uniform came running over from the main terminal desk. He'd obviously been called when the police arrived, but he was just now learning the full scope of the situation. "What's going on here?" the supervisor demanded, looking frazzled. Officer Chun filled him in quickly. As the supervisor listened, his expression grew more and more horrified. When the officer finished explaining, the supervisor turned to Patricia with a look of absolute disbelief. "Patricia, please tell me you didn't actually destroy a federal inspector's passport." Patricia couldn't speak. She just stood there, staring at James's credentials as if they might disappear if she looked at them long enough. The supervisor turned to James with obvious panic in his voice. "Inspector Turner, I am so sorry about this incident. This is absolutely not how our airline operates. We have strict policies against discrimination, and Patricia's behavior was completely unacceptable. I'm sure you do have policies, James replied calmly. But based on what I observed today and what I've experienced personally, those policies aren't being followed. James looked around at the crowd of passengers who were still watching the drama unfold. Many of them were recording on their phones, and he knew this incident would be shared across social media within hours. But more importantly, he had the evidence he needed to support the discrimination complaints his office had received. Patricia has been working at this gate for 12 years, James continued. The complaints we've received describe exactly the kind of treatment I experienced today. This wasn't a one-time mistake. This appears to be a pattern of behavior. The supervisor looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Inspector Turner, what can we do to make this right? Well, first, I'm going to need a new passport immediately so I can continue my travel. Second, I'll be filing a comprehensive report about today's incident with my superiors. Third, your airline will need to cooperate fully with our ongoing investigation into discriminatory practices. Patricia finally found her voice. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know who you were. James turned to look at her directly. That's exactly the point. You shouldn't treat any passenger the way you treated me today, regardless of who they are. Every person who comes to this counter deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. The police officers were taking notes and photos of the destroyed passport. The airport security officers were documenting everything for their reports. The airline supervisor was making frantic phone calls to his managers, and James stood in the middle of it all, watching as his simple undercover investigation had turned into a federal case that would likely make national news. He thought about his wife and son back home and how they would react when they heard about what had happened. He thought about all the other passengers who had faced similar treatment, but didn't have federal credentials to fall back on. This was bigger now than just one discriminatory gate agent. This was about accountability, about justice, and about making sure that what happened to him today would never happen to anyone else. The real consequences were just beginning. 3 hours later, James sat in the airport administrative office, watching as officials from multiple agencies worked to sort out the mess that had started at Gate B-27. His torn passport lay on the desk in front of him, now sealed in an evidence bag. The airline had arranged for an emergency passport replacement, but it would take at least 2 days to process through the proper channels. The office buzzed with activity. FBI agents had arrived to investigate the destruction of federal documents. FAA regional supervisors were flying in from Chicago. The airline's corporate headquarters had dispatched their crisis management team. What had started as a routine undercover investigation had mushroomed into a federal case with serious implications for everyone involved. James's phone hadn't stopped ringing. His wife had called 6 times after seeing the first news reports. Online, his supervisor at the FAA wanted hourly updates. News reporters were already camping outside the airport, hoping for interviews. The video footage from passengers' phones had gone viral on social media, with millions of views and thousands of comments. Patricia sat in a different office down the hall, accompanied by a lawyer the airline had provided and 2 FBI agents who were questioning her about the incident. Through the glass partition, James could see her crying and shaking her head repeatedly. Her 12-year career with the airline was over, and she was facing federal criminal charges that could result in prison time. The airline supervisor, Mr. Williams, had been pacing the office for the past hour, making phone calls and trying to contain the damage to his company's reputation. The incident was already being discussed on major news networks, and the airline's stock price had dropped 3% since the story broke. Inspector Turner, Mr. Williams said, hanging up from another call with corporate headquarters. Our legal team wants to discuss a resolution to this matter. We're prepared to make a substantial settlement offer. James looked up from the report he was writing. Mr. Williams, this isn't just about money. This is about a pattern of discriminatory behavior that's been going on for months, maybe years. understand your concerns, and I want you to know that we're taking this very seriously. Patricia has been suspended without pay, and we're launching a full investigation into all complaints filed against our staff at this location." An FBI agent named Special Agent Thompson entered the office carrying a thick folder. "Inspector Turner? We've finished our preliminary interview with the gate agent. She's admitted to destroying your passport but claims she thought it was fraudulent. However, based on the witness statements and video evidence, it's clear that her treatment of you was discriminatory motivated." James nodded. "What happens next?" "She be charged with destruction of federal documents and interference with a federal investigation. Depending on how the prosecutor wants to handle it, she could face additional civil rights violation charges. The minimum sentence is usually significant fines and probation, but given the severity and public nature of this case, jail time is possible." Mr. Williams sat down heavily in his chair. "Inspector Turner, I've been with this airline for 23 years. I've never seen anything like this. Patricia's actions don't represent our company values or policies, but they do represent what's been happening at Gate B27, James replied firmly. "I have detailed observations from today, plus months of complaint records from other passengers. This wasn't an isolated incident. Over the next 2 weeks, the full scope of the investigation became clear. The FAA launched a comprehensive review of the airline's customer service practices at Denver International Airport. They discovered that Patricia had been involved in over 60 passenger complaints in the past 2 years. With a clear pattern of treating minorities differently from white passengers, the airline faced massive fines from the FAA, totaling over $2 million. They were required to implement new training programs for all customer service staff, focusing on unconscious bias and proper treatment of all passengers. Every employee at the Denver location had to complete 40 hours of diversity and inclusion. Training. Patricia was eventually sentenced to 6 months in federal prison and ordered to pay $50,000 in fines. She lost her job, her pension, and her reputation. The judge specifically noted that her actions had violated the civil rights of not just James, but potentially hundreds of other passengers over the years. The airline settled with James for an undisclosed amount, reported by news sources to be well over $1 million. But more importantly to James, they agreed to implement sweeping changes to their hiring, training, and oversight practices. James used his experience to push for new federal guidelines on preventing discrimination in aviation. He testified before Congress about the need for better oversight of airline customer service practices. His story became a case study in federal training programs for aviation employees across the country. The torn passport, carefully preserved and framed, now hangs in James's office at the FAA. It serves as a daily reminder of why his work matters. Below it is a photo from 6 months after the incident, showing James speaking at a conference on civil rights in aviation, surrounded by other passengers who had faced similar discrimination but had never been able to get justice. The incident also led to the creation of a new federal reporting system for discrimination complaints in airports. Passengers can now file reports directly with the FAA, which investigates patterns of behavior and takes action against airlines that allow discriminatory practices to continue. James received hundreds of letters from people who had experienced similar treatment while traveling. Many thanked him for standing up and fighting back. Others shared their own stories of humiliation and discrimination that they had never reported because they didn't think anyone would believe them or take action. One letter particularly touched him. It was from a young black college student who had been traveling to a job interview when she was subjected to excessive questioning and searches at the same gate. She had been so humiliated that she almost didn't go to the interview. But seeing James's story inspired her to file her own complaint, which led to additional investigations and changes. The video of the incident continued to circulate online, becoming a powerful example of how discrimination can happen anywhere, to anyone. It was used in training programs, diversity workshops, and college courses on civil rights. The moment when Patricia tore up James's passport became a symbol of institutional racism and the importance of standing up against injustice. James often reflected on how different things might have been if he hadn't been carrying his federal credentials that day. How many other passengers had faced similar treatment from Patricia over the years? How many had been too intimidated, too tired, or too afraid to fight back? His undercover investigation had accomplished far more than he ever expected. It had exposed systematic discrimination, led to criminal charges, forced policy changes across the entire industry, and inspired countless others to speak up about their own experiences, but perhaps most importantly, it had sent a clear message that discrimination would not be tolerated no matter where it occurred or who perpetrated it. The gate agent who had thought she could intimidate and humiliate a passenger because of his race had instead exposed herself and her company to federal scrutiny and criminal prosecution. James's story became proof that justice, while sometimes delayed, could still prevail, and that sometimes the most powerful tool against discrimination is simply the courage to stand up and fight back, even when the odds seem impossible. The torn passport in his office served as a permanent reminder that the fight for equality and justice never truly ends, but that each victory, no matter how small, makes the world a little more fair for everyone.